Today, we're talking with Sean Felty from Greenlin Pet Resorts and also Next Tree Strategies. Sean, thanks for coming. Start off with giving a brief intro of your background because you come from the pet care industry, obviously have a lot of experience there.
We own and operate Greenlin Pet Resorts. We have 6 locations in central Pennsylvania. So if you've ever been to the Hershey Conference, our kind of region is right there where the Pet Boarding Expo East is. So business is a family business, around 23 years old. My wife, Jen, and I kind of joined back in after building careers in healthcare and finance about 13 years ago now to kind of help expand the business. So
needless to say, you have plenty of operational experience of running a pet care business, scaled to 6 locations, no small operation. It's a sizable endeavor that you've undertaken. And so with that, you obviously deal with labor challenges. And so that kind of, I would imagine, pushed you towards this next direction that you've kind of gone in. Is that right?
Yeah, for sure. So when you're scaling and expanding, you're in the mode where like you're just constantly hiring because you have a place to move everyone. And you just kind of consider that an investment of, it's a cost of doing business to grow, right? You need to train people and have them ready to open up that next location. But somewhere around, I think between like the 3rd and 4th location is where we really started to look at how we should, really dial in labor at specific facilities that weren't really hiring to bring people on to the next facility. And that's where our eyes were kind of opened really wide. And we realized that we had a lot of work to do, at least at that point. And so that kind of led me into trying to solve the labor problem, which I've heard about a lot in our industry.
For sure. We talk about it a lot at Goose. It's, the largest cost by far that these businesses have that they have to deal with, but it's very manageable and it should kind of get more attention perhaps than what maybe some give it. I know, others have challenges with managing labor costs. Tell me more about kind of the direction or where they should start when they think about that.
Yeah, so the first thing I think that I always like relate for people is that like labor always starts with your schedule and it all just like flows up from there. So at the ground level, like the most important thing is paying attention to your schedule, but having some sort of system in place to make sure you're being consistent there. So I see a lot of people, and I don't know if you've experienced this along the way in operating your facility, but like at times your schedule becomes a bit of a negotiation if you don't have like a really good system in place, right? So an example of that is just like, maybe you have a week where volume spikes and you get slammed and, a manager or a lead is coming to you and saying like, hey, we really need more hours on this day or that day. And, for whatever reason at that time, you may authorize that. And then that kind of becomes the way you operate moving forward. And so if you don't have a system in place to keep it where it should be and where you want it to be, it will just constantly be this kind of up and down game of trying to figure out why it's high or low.
What is the correct answer to that? I know there's lots of different sizes of pet care facilities in this industry, but is there one magic metric that they should be trying to hit as far as how should they think about labor as far as spend goes? Is it a direct correlation to revenue or what do you line it up to?
So you always want to look at your labor as a percentage of revenue. So like that's something that when you run payroll every week or every 2 weeks, however you're doing that, you always want to be looking at that labor percentage. But the best metric that I've found that works for people is shooting for a labor hours per pet metric. So when you're doing that, you're looking at the total hours you used and the number of pets that were in your facility. You're figuring out your labor hours per pet, and you can use that to set a target. And this helps people kind of like bridge the gap between, what an owner is expecting and what a manager is supposed to do, because you could use that labor hours per pet metric to essentially create a target for how many hours you want to use.
What should that target be? Like in our industry, I've heard a lot of different numbers getting tossed around as far as labor is, percentage of revenue and 30, 40, 50%, right? Like where is the optimum level of labor in this industry?
So the labor percent target that I always tell people is 40% is the goal. And that's From what I understand, that's like all in labor costs. So that's like your health and benefits, your 401k contributions, your the fees that go along with that, your payroll taxes. That's kind of like the main metric. And I pretty much just base that off of whatever Taya from Pet Vet M&A says. And I know she said before that it used to be lower and now she kind of has moved it up, but she says 40%, and that's kind of what I like to go by.
So I'm always a little curious how others approach this. I know it's always been a challenge at my own facility, the seasonality of the industry and trying to manage employee schedules. And this may be more of a problem with smaller operators versus scaled operators as yourself, because you have probably more consistent patterns with more consistent employees. But I would imagine there is some scaling up and scaling down throughout the year. And how do you manage those employees' expectations through those timeframes?
The biggest hurdle there is figuring out like what's your perfect mix of full-time, part-time, and like what we would call flex employees should be. So in pretty much every other industry, people manage by FTE, and FTE stands for full-time equivalent. So a lot of people confuse that with like FTE means full-time employee, but if you use FTE in its like real capacity of planning for labor, you can get to a point where you have a certain amount of full-time employees that are essentially always going to get hours, right? Because this is like, you have to have a minimum safe operating level, right? You have to open the store no matter how many dogs are in there. Like, you're going to have a certain amount of people and they're always going to get their hours. And then you get to your part-time mix, and part-timers, give them a range of hours that you're going to be able to provide for them. And then your flex employees are people that you bring on like seasonally, right? It really all starts with looking at a lot of your historical data and looking at your average volumes by day of week, looking at that in a period of, let's say May through August, and then looking at that for the period of September through April, right? You're looking at how many FTEs you're using in those periods, and you can figure out, okay, what should my core full-time staff be? And then you can figure out, okay, if I hire two part-timers instead of one full-timer, what hours do I have available? And when I go into an interview, I can actually be super upfront with them and say like, hey, we can offer you between 15 and 20 hours per week for a part-timer, right? And you can just lay out what the expectation is, and that will help with some of the need to maybe reduce payroll on a day-to-day basis.
You'd mentioned, tracking the number of pets and lining that up with the number of, potential FTEs that you need at any given time. And you said also the historical numbers give you insight into what you're going to expect, as many are right now kind of in the spring break kind of rush time of year. And then we're moving into April, where there could be a little bit of a lull depending on where you are seasonality wise. But you need to have a good forecast. Is that right? On like the number of pets you expect, because you're making the schedule in advance, a couple weeks maybe. And is that kind of the trick, is having an accurate forecast of what the number of pets you expect to have during a time frame before you make that schedule?
You're going to look at historical data to forecast as best you can. So you can't perfectly forecast. People operate differently. So like, some people take reservations, they require reservations for daycare as well. Some people don't. Obviously, if you know ahead of time, that's better. But if you know ahead of time how many pets are coming, you know what labor hours per pet you're shooting for, then you know how many hours you need on the schedule for those specific days.
Your basic prescription is have a tool in place, or a forecast tool in place, that lets you know how many pets are going to be expected during a time frame that will allow you to set the schedule more optimally for that time frame, and you are matching that number of pets with the number of employees more accurately and more consistently over time. What other metrics or data points should they be tracking or be aware of if they needed to scale up or scale down? Or is that something that you advise they do in like short-term periods? If maybe you've set the schedule and oops, it's not as busy, or it's way busier, how do you make adjustments on the fly?
There's a dashboard built into this in Labor Lens, but you're looking at your average volumes Monday through Friday. And let's say Mondays, your average volume's 80 dogs between boarding and daycare. There's also a kind of mechanism in place. If you were to say, let's say our average on Mondays 80 dogs, and this upcoming Monday we know we're going to have 120 because it's something's going on, we're having an event, it's getting really busy. A way for you to type that number in and just see what the target of hours is. On a day-to-day basis, if you are overstaffed, this will also tell you like how many hours you're off based on what you have scheduled. And then it becomes a matter of like, all right, we need to reduce by 5 hours today. We try to figure out how to do that. And the thing I tell people to do typically is just, ask if anybody would like to go home early. A lot of times you get an answer, and that ticks off the whole chunk, sometimes half of it. But either way, a lot of people will just bail and take the day off.
I love this saying. My grandpa used to tell me this back in the day. One boy's a whole boy, two boys is a half a boy, and three boys is no boys at all. Meaning, when you're overscheduled, like less work gets done. And if you have too many people on the schedule, oh, I thought they did that. No, I thought and nobody is doing it because nobody's taking ownership. But when you are optimally scheduled, everybody has their role and they're running at their highest capability.
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of counterintuitive in that way. People always think that you need more people. And yes, like there's a certain number of people you 100% need. We're all in favor of safety here, right? But like adding more people does not mean more work gets done. It really doesn't ever mean that. And when you start looking at, like, a lot of times it's about putting a constraint in place, like, okay, you have X amount of dogs based on our labor hours per pet. This is how many hours you have to use. It's about like putting that constraint in place, and then the team kind of figuring out like, okay, well, how do we have to work in order to get this done? And that's exactly what happens, is like people step up and they know the work needs to get done, and then everybody eventually kind of understands their role and what they need to be doing. But if you have extra people, that's exactly what will happen. And then that will also kind of permeate into the culture inside of your business. And so your culture then becomes one that does not involve productivity, and your culture shouldn't all be all productivity. Like obviously there's a ton of other aspects, but like that's got to be one of them, right? Because we got to operate efficiently.
What are the end results that you've been able to produce for actual facilities?
Most people have 5 to 8% that they can save. That's kind of like the average in the middle. You can save 5 to 8% of your revenues, right? So if you're at $1 million in revenue, each percentage point's worth 10 grand, right? So 50 to $80,000 if you're at that kind of 7-figure mark. I mean, I've seen people. I had somebody cut $10,000 per pay period. So yeah, 26 pay periods. You can do the math on that. Now that's not super typical, but I've seen anywhere from 80 to $140,000 a year being saved. And I've literally like pulled these numbers and seen these numbers, and it's pretty wild.
That's nothing to ignore, right? But as we said, it's the biggest cost for these businesses of operation. And I think what this does, and named appropriately, labor lens, when you look at it through this lens, you're shining a light on what it should be and maybe where the missteps are. Very awesome. So talking a little bit more about labor lens and the actual tool that it is, what systems does it work with? Do you need specific scheduling software? Does that matter? I mean, I know a lot of people in this industry use Homebase and When I Work and Connect Teams and all kinds of different scheduling tools, but it's pretty agnostic, right?
You can use it with any software. Really, what Labor Lens is going to show you in terms of scheduling is it's going to show you the number of hours that you should be scheduling. And so then you're going to Labor Lens, you're seeing, okay, how many hours do I have available on Mondays or whatever day it is? And then when you make your schedule, you have that information and you can use the schedule. So it integrates with Goose, and it will pull pet counts and daycare days automatically. And then it also integrates with Paychex Flex. So if you use Paychex Flex, it will pull your hours that were clocked in, clocked out, worked, and you can actually automate a lot of this system. But We are basically integrating with every major payroll system in our that people are using in our industry. So there's like 6 payroll systems that everybody uses. And we're going to be automating your labor percentage reporting as well. So that part isn't built in yet, but pretty soon, I mean, I kind of have a version of it for my own business just because, you know, it has to go through some more development to be like released to everyone. But you're going to basically be able to do all your labor percentage reporting without having to touch anything. It's just going to be fully automated. But as a tool now, it's basically 4 numbers that you plug in. If you're not using Goose or Paychex, you're plugging in 4 numbers, your manager is, and it's going to tell them what their target is for the day. And it's going to tell them how far off they are from their target based on the hours they have scheduled.
So what are those 4 numbers? They're plugging in pet counts?
Pet nights, right? Daycare days, scheduled hours, and then actual hours.
And is there a industry benchmark in regard? It varies quite a bit, I'm sure, between operations, depending how each operation just operates, how they're set up process wise. But is there a benchmark that people should be thinking about as number of employees per number of pets?
Yeah, so it would be hours, number of hours, and like you said, it does vary pretty widely, right? Because one facility might do like daycare and training only, so their labor hours per pet's going to be way higher, or like cage free boarding, right? 24/7 cage free boarding is going to have a higher benchmark because they need more people. So I would be hesitant to say an exact benchmark. I would say you want to be under 1. I think that's a pretty good first step for people based on what I see. The default benchmark in the system is like 0.79. That was created based off of our 6 facilities. And what's really interesting is like as I've started to work with more people, we have a whole process for like developing benchmarks.
What does that number mean? 0.79.
That is the labor hours per pet. So yeah, so if you take your volume and you multiply it by that labor hours per pet, that's going to give you your target of hours. But what's really interesting is that that default benchmark, all the people I worked with one-on-one, that's what we started with, and like that's what their benchmark is as well now. And like as I go through, we have a process for developing benchmarks based on your own facility, right? Because like there's a lot of variation. So I always like look at historical data and set it from there. But there's like a decent amount of facilities that it turns out that is like what their benchmark ends up being set at because that's what they're already shooting for, or they're already kind of almost there. Like my vision for this is also like as more people use the system, we can get down to like very specific benchmarks based on facility type, right? Just, what services they offer, what's the mix, that kind of stuff.
How much of it also takes a little bit of consulting from you as far as analyzing how they operate? And maybe you look at a particular facility's numbers and they have X number of employee hours scheduled compared to Y number of pets. And you're like, wow, why is there so much extra here? Do you need to dig deeper sometimes into operations and say, why are you doing it this way? And there's better processes to maybe cut down on labor hours in certain areas? How much of that kind of goes into the equation as well? Like just reevaluating how a facility operates.
There's a decent amount of that goes on. I mean, that's basically the path you have to take to actually solve the problem, right? The encouraging part is that when you kind of present this to your team that like this is a priority, just about every organization I've worked with has had somebody within the organization. It's not always a GM, but a lot of times it is. They step up and they already kind of know how the facility could be more efficient. So it helps you kind of like bridge that conversation when you start talking about it, and then you give them kind of a tool to say like, hey, here's what we want to do and this is what we're shooting for. The pieces will kind of start to fall into place, at least in some capacity. You always have people that step up, and then you always have people that really will dig their heels in and you're asking me to do more with less and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, because I would imagine most of the conversations start because they have a feeling that there's leakage. And by actually going through the exercise, then it puts hard data against the feeling. And it's like, yeah, you're right. There's actual data showing that you're missing out on opportunities and you can be more efficient in these areas or at these time frames. If I was a facility thinking about digging deeper in this area, where do I even start?
If you're not looking at your labor percentage, you want to pull what that is. So I always tell people like you want to look at the whole year because you want to know like where you're at for a full year, and depending on when you look at these numbers, they may be good or bad, right? If you look at the summer, your labor percentage probably looks incredible. And then in the off season, it might look a little bit off, and there will be variation. So you're going to overperform in the summer and you're going to underperform in the that's just the nature of our business. But in any case, I always tell people like just look at the last 10 days. If you're too overwhelmed by like the data and pulling a whole year, look at the last 10 days, pull your revenue for the exact same dates as the pay period and use a cash report because you pay out money in cash, and then report your salary with taxes, or your salaries with taxes. You're going to pull the owner's salary out typically, and just see like over the last 10 pay periods, what was your labor percentage, and go from there. But if you're looking at that and it's like 60% or 55% or, even 50%, like there are things that can be done for you to like massively improve that. It is really not, I hate to say this, but like it's really not that difficult to go from like 60% to 50% if you're that high. Because like we talked about earlier, like there's a lot of people in your facility, but there's like a lot of people that aren't maybe doing as much, or roles are just a little wonky.
Do you ever have any ideas or advice for folks who are a little sensitive to cutting hours or employees? How can you redirect their efforts in more, a lucrative format?
The way I approach that is like, I don't ever want to like go into someone's business and say like, oh, you gotta clear house here. But what happens is you start paying attention to these numbers and then you just use natural attrition to your advantage. So like we all have, not all of us, but I come across a lot of people that have like a knee-jerk reaction that when somebody decides that they're going to move on from their facility, they immediately are like, we got to post an ad, we got to fill that position. And they don't think like, all right, maybe we should look at how the work's being done and maybe we can rearrange our schedule or make some changes to be more efficient and then not have to fill in that position. So it's more about like, okay, we're paying attention. This is our target. And then as we pay attention, as we kind of roll out this initiative in our business, we're going to use that data that we're informed with to like make those hiring decisions and just kind of use that natural attrition to our advantage.
And you mentioned Taya earlier, and she's probably the expert to opine on this, but I'm going to ask you, as you know, private equity is in full force in this industry, and they obviously look at this number quite a bit as they're thinking about acquiring a new business in their portfolio. What is their take on labor as a percentage of sales, and why is it advantageous for a business to maybe optimize that number before they hit the market?
Their take, from what I understand, is that if you have a system in place for this and your labor percentage is at kind of a good level, like 40%, your business is way more valuable than if you're at, 50 or 60% and you don't have some sort of system in place for it. So in addition to like, let's call it, let's say you save $100,000 a year putting a system in place to fix this problem for yourself. In addition to like that extra $100,000 for the lifetime of you kind of operating the business, when you go to sell your business, that system and the processes you have in place to follow it, the multiple on your business may jump up from a 3 to a 5, right? So in addition to that $100,000 a year at exit, you're going to get 2 or 3 times more value out of your business if you sell.
So that's a big lever that you can optimize.
Aside from like making sure you have a decent rental agreement, like this is the number. You can't really be profitable in our industry without managing it. You can have a cool, fun business, but like it's about maximizing the amount of resources you have to put back into that business to make it even better, right? Train your people, make your facility better. Like you won't have that extra if you're not paying attention to this.
Well, Sean, I appreciate you jumping on here and talking about this topic with us. I know it's a hot topic in the industry, as it should be. It's an important metric for any business to measure and optimize over time if they want to be profitable in the long run. So how can folks get a hold of you? Are you doing demos for Labor Lens? What's that look like if somebody wants to take a deeper dive here?
If you go to demo.laborlens.com, there's a page there. You can schedule a demo directly. There's also a form on there. I did a webinar a couple months ago, and it's just a free training I have available for people to sign up for. So yeah, demo.laborlens.com.
And this is for any pet care business that's doing boarding, daycare, grooming, training, full service.
It mostly involves boarding and daycare, although I have a few people that we kind of hacked a grooming module for them. But yeah, pet boarding and daycare businesses generally, yeah, multi-location, obviously savings are even higher. So
Okay, so you just tapped into something I failed to mention earlier. So how does that lens look differently from a single location to a multi-location operator? Is there something different that they should be thinking about if you are running multiple locations?
there may be an advantage if they're located like regionally fairly close, where, let's say you have location that's a little slow, you need to reduce hours, but you have another one that can afford those hours. You can kind of move people around. So that can help. Typically though, I just start with, each location has its own dashboard, and the benchmarks for us, they're all the same. Some facilities are laid out differently, so the benchmarks can change by facility, but we just treat each one as its own thing and try to, nail down labor at each specific facility. When you have multiple, it's kind of like sometimes you can get in the habit of looking at that big bird's eye view. And when you like really drill down on specific locations and maybe even compare locations, you could say, okay, well, this location was at this labor hours per pet. Why wasn't this one? That kind of stuff. So you just have more data.
So even if you do have multiple locations, it needs to be a location focused view. Well, I can't thank you enough for, joining me today and talking through this. People love to just get a little more insight on how to be more profitable in these businesses and to succeed and ultimately get that exit they're looking for down the line. So thanks again, and we will see you at the next show.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Chris. See ya.